Okay, so we've had a number of requests for me to go through some of the poems of Emily Dickinson that are on the course. A lot of you are looking at Dickinson as a possible poet, and of course, as one of the three female poets we've dealt with, Rich and Bishop already, if you have those three poets covered off, you're very likely to get a question in your leaving cert, okay? So I'm going to go through really quickly the mind map on Dickinson, um, and then I'm going to look at a couple of the poems, and I'll do two parts in this. There'll be a video on kind of the celebratory poems. If you know Dickinson, you know that her work is kind of easily divided thematically into poems which are celebratory, and then the darker, kind of more psychological poems. So let's have a look anyway at the mind map. So we start off, right? What do we know about Dickinson? Well, first thing we know is that her work is deeply, deeply personal, okay? This is a poet who, wrote work which is introspective. This is a poet who wrote work which was inspired by her own experience of life, her sense of the world, and is not outward looking. It's poetry which is very much inward looking. It's poetry which is psychological. And in that sense, when you read a Dickinson poem, you're offered an intimate insight into her life and experiences. And I think that's one of the most striking things about her work thematically, how as a reader, one gets so close to Dickinson's experience of life. There's nothing left hidden. It's very much as confessional and as honest a form of writing as one can imagine. We know that Dickinson was a poet who was interested in and who celebrated the beauty of nature. She, in many ways, some of her poems can be described as nature poems, but there is absolutely, unquestionably, a connection between her celebration of the beauty and the wonders of the natural world and her religious faith. So we're going to see that now today in a moment when we look at a couple of the nature poems. The reason for the exaltation, the reason for the sense of joy and the thrill that one feels when we read those nature poems is because the beauty of nature for Dickinson is evidence of God's existence. Okay, and that's very, very, very important. However, she didn't just write poems which are full of joy and happiness. Dickinson famously wrote these incredible poems which captured her often raw and visceral insights into the reality of loneliness, and I love that word, melancholia. Now, when modern readers look at poems like I Felt the Funeral in My Brain or I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, and those dark poems, we often think of the word depression. Oh, she was suffering from depression. But of course, that's a modern term. Dickinson was never diagnosed as somebody who was depressed. So I prefer the word melancholy. I prefer the word melancholy when we're talking about her. And that's just this deep, ingrained sadness, this sense of darkness, this awareness of how challenging life can be. And there is no doubt that that is a feature of her poetry, which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Dickinson was a poet who often deals with the idea of death and the transitory nature of life, how life is transient, Transient, transient. She is interested in that moment. As I mentioned, I heard a fly buzz when I died, but at that moment when life ends, and she's interested in thinking about what happens after life ends. I think one of the reasons that her nature poems, when they are optimistic, are so optimistic is because nature gives her a sense that after this life ends, there is another life, a heavenly life, an existence, that goes beyond our temporal existence. And I think in the darker poems, there's doubt in relation to that. There's a sense that, death is definitive. There is no afterlife. So the idea that death is definitive and that there is no afterlife is certainly something which troubles this poet and which she explores in some of her poems in a tremendously interesting way. Of course, Dickinson is just one of the most recognizable voices in all of English language poetry. There's no doubt about it. We all know the story of her life and how she really lived quite a hermetic life from her early 20s on. I wouldn't, if I was writing essays on her, guys, I wouldn't start speculating on the reasons for her decision to kind of close herself off from the world. She wasn't completely closed off from the world. She had regular contact with her family, but she didn't venture out into society really at all from her early 20s. And she certainly, I think one of the things that I love about her is that she wrote in her own voice. So any of these words describe the fact that when you read a Dickinson poem, there are things about her poetry which make it identifiably her poetry. So the words quirky, particular, singular, idiosyncratic, eccentric, distinctive, any of those words could be in a question to do with her style. Now, of course, words like quirky and idiosyncratic, maybe the examiner wouldn't use those words in case there were students who didn't understand what they meant. But it wouldn't surprise me at all to see a question on Dickinson in which they refer to her eccentric or singular or distinctive style of writing, because her work is quite identifiably distinctive and it is easy to spot a Dickinson poem when you see one. One of the reasons of that, of course, is because of her unconventional punctuation. This is a poet who throws in capital letters where, they don't appear to be required. She is a poet who often uses the dash instead of kind of conventional punctuation. So where you might expect a full stop or a comma or a semicolon or a colon, you have the dash. Not always, but it is there. It is sporadic. There's a sense that the poetry is reflective of her thought process as she writes. So it's very deliberate. It's not, there's this interpretation of Dickinson's poetry that she was just like emptying her brain down on the page, and that's why you have this kind of scattered look. But that's to ignore the fact that every line is very carefully structured. That's to ignore the fact that this poet often employs meter and metrical schemes. So her work is very deliberate, and when she uses, a dash, or when she deliberately capitalizes a letter, that adds some curious quality to her work, making us as readers, forcing us as readers to consider why she's done that. And often there's no answer, but it certainly makes her work really interesting. Never forget that while she wrote poetry which was somewhat strange and unusual, while she wrote in her own voice in a kind of idiosyncratic style, this was a poet who clearly studied poetry. This was a poet who displays technical control in the same way and as impressively as someone like Keats or Wordsworth or Bishop or any of the great poets. This was a great poet. Dickinson was a great poet. So her work often features, as I said, beats that's brought about through meter or rhyming, alliteration, sibilance, these kinds of techniques. You see them in her poetry all the time. Her poems are often written in quatrains, which are, stanzas of 4 lines each. There are distinct rhyming schemes often, and when the rhyming schemes are irregular, you get the sense that that's deliberate as well, to communicate something about her feelings of that time, maybe of unease. She employs, as I said, very particular meters. Tetrameter means that there would be 8 syllabic beats in a line, or 4 pairs of syllables. Trimeter means that there will be 6 syllabic beats in a line, or 3 pairs of syllables, and that can make her work, again, very rhythmic, almost hypnotic at times, the rhythm in her poetry. So there's that word, mesmeric and hypnotic. She really did write poetry which was appealing. For me, as you know, at the heart of all interesting writing is symbolism. I love it. And, if Yeats was, a master of symbolism, well, Dickinson was his match. Dickinson was a genius. One of the things that she does a lot in her poetry is use nature imagery, images of birds, bees, flowers, butterflies. That's something that you notice in her poetry. But that nature imagery is always, it's not there just for the sake of celebrating or noting the existence of the wonders of nature. There's a subtext. There's something underneath the surface. There's a significance to these images of birds and bees and flowers that can be drilled down into, and means that the work is substantial and rewards repeated reading. One of my favourite things about Dickinson is the fact that her language is often really precise, that there's this economy of language in this poet's work. And some of my favourite examples I've listed here, the idea of heavenly hurt. I mean, that's just one of the great, noun adjective combinations. It's an oxymoron, hurt, pain, suffering. We associate heaven with the sublime, with perfection, with something which is flawless. And what she's doing is capturing the exquisite nature of her pain when she adds the word heavenly to the word hurt. Wonderful. This example here, to capture her sense of melancholy, her sense that the sadness that she's feeling is all consuming and is never going to end. How do you communicate that abstract concept? Well, you use the phrase seal despair, that famous line, "'Tis the seal despair." Seal means, everything is closed. There is no possibility of escape. There's this image of claustrophobia. It almost brings up an image of a coffin, of somebody being locked inside this box and there's no room to breathe. And that captures a psychological state in the most precise and economic manner. Quartz contentment, endless summer days. I love in hope is the thing with feathers, the images of the gale and the storm. And we'll come to what those mean in just a moment. Finally, just in the mind map, one of the things that Bishop does is Dickinson. One of the things that Dickinson does is she creates these absolutely fantastic little dramas. These little scenarios, these scenes which in which play out her psychological dramas. The funeral in her brain is a brilliant example. Being on a sea which is strange, being in a land which is chill, lying in a coffin lying in a bed at the moment of death and hearing a fly buzz. She was absolutely brilliant, and there was a wit there. I believe there's humor in this poet's work. There was a wit there. There was an imagination. Standing in her garden or at her window, watching a bird coming down the walk. These are clever little stories, little scenarios, which she draws with great precision in order to explore the thematic concerns that interest her. So that's the kind of overview of Dickinson's poetry. What I'm going to do now is have a quick look at two of her, nature stroke celebratory poems. And the first one is called A Bird Came Down the Walk. Now, this is just a brilliant poem. It's so lively and so clever, and it's filled with a kind of a vigor. But then you have that change halfway through the poem where you have the thought and the consideration, which causes her to pause and breaks the rhythm of the poem. We'll have a look at it really quickly. As I said, she wrote in quatrains. This poem consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quatrains. It follows initially a very clear rhyming scheme. We have walk, saw, halves, raw, dew, grass, wall, pass, eyes, abroad, thought, head. By the way, abroad and head do rhyme because they end in the same letter, even though they don't sound the same. Don't get me started on rhyming. It's if you want to go down a rabbit hole, go and start reading about what rhyming is. I used to think it was simple. It's not. Let's have a quick look. So here we go. This is a poem that's written in a very distinct meter. Count the beats. A bird came down the walk. 6 beats. He did not know I saw. 6 beats. He bit an angle worm in halves. 8 beats. And ate the fellow raw. So we have 4 lines, 3 of which are written in trimeter, or lines of 6 syllabic beats, 1 of which is written in tetrameter, and the combination of those meters gives the line a kind of a jaunty, happy, celebratory tone. Listen to it when it's spoken as it should be. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angle worm in halves and ate the fellow raw. Now that is absolutely deliberately a sing-song, kind of joyful tone. And what's striking is the image of violence and brutality that's in the middle of this very, as I said, jaunty image. Like the angleworm is bit in halves, but the angleworm is there for the poet as its only reason to exist is because it provides food for the bird. So this is proof. When Bishop, I keep on saying Bishop, my apologies, when Dickinson looks at nature, she sees a plan, she sees design. Robert Frost has a brilliant poem called Design. He's not in your course, but what a poet Robert Frost was. And he's got a brilliant poem called Design about the idea that if you want proof of God's existence, just look at the world of nature. And that's certainly there in this poem. Look at the next stanza. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sidewise to the wall to let a beetle pass. So we have this, this image of the bird has everything it needs. It's got its food, it's got its drink, it's light of foot, it's hopping sideways, it's polite, it's happy, it's mannerly, letting the beetle pass. The sense is that Dickinson, with a real smile on her face, with a wit that is notable, is celebrating the beauty of nature as personified by, or as represented by, or as symbolized by this scene of a bird on a path in her garden. And when she describes the bird, she does so with like cinematic imagery. Look at this image. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad. And this is the first line, I think, if you're going to prepare this poem. It's a great simile to learn. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. They looked like frightened beads. So we have the bead, which is an inanimate object, and then the idea of it being frightened. And we see that the poet is looking at the bird as a creature with a life, with feelings. The poet is empathizing with the bird. She feels a connection with the bird. It's not an abstract creature that she's merely observing. It's a part of nature which and she feels a connection to that part of nature. So it's really, really striking image. They looked like frightened beads, these rapid eyes. And then we have this really lovely enjambment as it rolls from this stanza into this stanza. He stirred his velvet head like one in danger, another little simile, and then the scene changes. Cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers, I love this so much, and rowed him softer home than oars divide the ocean. It's an incredibly cinematic moment in the poem. The bird is there. The poet intervenes, offers it a crumb, and the bird, instead of taking the crumb, opens its wings and takes to the sky. And takes to the sky with a flawless perfection, with an ease which the poet sees as being miraculous. And she uses this very vivid, striking image of the perfect stroke of an oar through water to capture the power and the ease and the rapid movement of the bird as it takes off. It is nature imagery at its absolute best. absolutely beautiful cinematic visual imagery. One thing that has often struck me about this poem is that the scene is perfect until the poet intervenes. That when she looks out there at nature, she sees a perfection that's reflected in the imagery and in the rhythm and the happiness of this poem. But when she intervenes, the bird is disturbed and flies away. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into that. Maybe I'm over analyzing. But for me, it's that sense that the world is a perfect place. The world contains God's beauty. The world and nature is evidence of the beauty of God. But when the poet thinks of herself, that sense of an idyllic perfection is shattered or broken. That, in other words, that when she looks at herself, she doesn't see the kind of inspiration or perfection as she sees when she looks at nature. The poem famously ends on one of her really unusual and idiosyncratic images. I think one of the great mistakes you make with Dickinson is trying to over explain what an image means. She describes the bird taking off as too silver for a seam. Now, silver is something which is a precious metal, so it's valuable. A seam is an edge, so where there's no seam, it's seamless, and when it's seamless, it's perfect. So this image of something which is perfection. And then you have this strange final section, or butterflies off banks of noon leap, and actually that shouldn't be, there's no S there, it's plashless as they swim. And, you know, I keep on saying this word cinematic. The imagery here is cinematic for me. And all I'm saying to you is, when I read out those lines, I see a warm summer's afternoon. It's noon, right? So midday. Butterflies are only are evident in nature in the summer. They are often colourful, but they are also, fragile, and their life is transient. And this image of a butterfly just jumping off a bank, and a bank there meaning like a river bank, and it jumps into the air. So it's not splash, it's plashless, and then swimming through the air. There's an image at the end of the poem of the wonder and beauty of nature as the butterfly takes off perfectly into the sky. And there's no question whatsoever that the quality of the image is striking. It's like looking at a movie. I don't know if one of my favorite films of all time is called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It's a great movie with Paul Newman and Robert Redford at their height as Hollywood stars. And it ends, that film famously ends. If you never watched the film, you should. It's got a great song, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, as the theme tune. But if you just Google or YouTube the final scene, it ends on a freeze frame. You know, a freeze frame, a dramatic freeze frame. And that's what this poem ends on. This image of the butterfly on a warm, bright summer's day, just leaping off into the air. Perfection, nature captured in one beautiful image. A fantastic poem in which she celebrates the wonder and the beauty of nature in the microcosm, microcosm, in the very singular scene of a bird walking down a path. The next poem we're going to look at really quickly is called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. If there's a poem that, I quote a lot, there's a number of poems I quote a lot, but this one, really does have meaning. It really does have meaning. It's an extraordinary poem, and it's a triumphant poem. Hope is an abstract concept. Hope, love, ambition, success, failure, hate, jealousy. these feelings, they are abstract concepts. How do you give them concrete form? How do you make them something tangible, something real, something which is it is possible to understand in a physical form? Well, in this case, Dickinson makes hope a bird. Hope is the thing with feathers. Now again, look at the rhythm or look at the structure of the poem. So we have 3 quatrains, a very short poem, 12 lines of poetry packed with meaning and with force and with philosophical observations and with real honesty about the poet's experience of life, and with some of the best. With some poems you go, I think this line's important. Every line in this poem is amazing. Again, as I said, 4 quatrains. Listen to the rhythm. Now, don't dismiss or don't forget that this is a poet who wrote in a very deliberate way. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So again, we have this combination of tetrameter and trimeter, lines of 4 pairs of syllabic beats and lines with 3 pairs of syllabic beats. We have this image of hope as something which, like a bird, perches, but it sits in the soul. Like a bird, sings a tune. It doesn't have any words. Bird song doesn't have any words, but bird song is beautiful, and it never stops. So this is a poem of celebration. Whereas in the previous poem, there was an actual bird, and the actual bird is symbolic of the beauty of nature. And therefore, for me, and I know there'll be teachers out there who'll say, no, she doesn't say that, therefore you can't interpret it. Well, I think poetry is about interpretation. And I see these things in these poems. I think the reason that she celebrates the bird in the previous poem is because the bird is emblematic of God's presence in the world. And that reassures her. And here now, the bird is not a literal bird. Here the bird is a metaphor that represents hope. And here, again, the tone is celebratory. She's not celebrating God's presence. She's celebrating her capacity to survive in adversity. And that's what hope is. And if you want to see proof in this poem that she has experienced adversity, all you have to do is look at the second and the third stanza. This is the best line in the poem. I absolutely love it so much. And sweetest in the gale is heard. And sweetest in the gale is heard. The gale is a storm. It's a dangerous, combination of wind and rain and lightning and thunder. And she's using pathetic fallacy and again, nature imagery to capture something abstract from her life. And that is those dark periods of psychological suffering which she endured. And that's why she says, hope, you only appreciate it when you're really in difficult circumstances. And she says that sore must be the storm that could have bashed a little bird that kept so many warm. Sore there is like an American colloquial term which means bad or extreme. And what she's saying is, you have to go into a really dark place, experience really extreme, melancholia, and you can say the word depression if you want. You have to be really unhappy to lose hope. But here in this poem, she says that little bird, that idea of hope, that thing that the suffering will end, that things will get better, that it's difficult to abash that. In other words, it's almost impossible to eradicate hope. It's a wonderful message that she's communicating in this poem. And I don't believe ever, when we think about Dickinson's poetry and we think about the idea of her poetry, being teaching poems, this idea that sometimes she wrote poems in order to be almost evangelical, to teach the reader a lesson, to be didactic, that word didactic, to create something like a fairy tale is created to teach a lesson to children. Well, I don't believe that Dickinson wrote poetry that was intended to be evangelical or indeed to be didactic. because I don't think many of these poems were ever published. And I think by the time she was writing most of these poems, her hope of being published were her hopes of being published had she had given up on the idea of being published. So this is poetry which is just expressing her experience of life. And what she's saying is that she has been in the gale, in the storm, and hope is one of the things that got her through. And in the final stanza of the most amazing poem, we have these two fantastic lines which always stay with me. You know, I think they're so precise and exact, and they capture this poet's ability to use language in such an economical way to create imagery which is stark and immediate and powerful and evocative, and those words which mean just striking. I've heard it in the chillest land. Look at the choice of verbs of adjectives she uses there. It's not chill, it's chillest. She's using what's called the superlative. superlative. The superlative form of a word means that there cannot be anything beyond it. So chillest means there's nowhere or nothing as chill or as cold. And on the strangest sea, again, we have this superlative form of the word. And what she's saying is, I have experienced extremes. Now, she's not talking about travel. This is not a poet who, left Amherst, Massachusetts very often in her life. And in fact, for most of her life, never left her home in Amherst, Massachusetts. So what she's talking about being out on the sea or being in cold lands, she's talking about psychology. She's talking about her experiences of the world, her experiences of emotional turmoil, of feeling cold and alone, and of feeling lost and despairing. That's what the chillest land represents. That's what the strangest sea represents. And in those two lines of poetry, we are given an insight into this poet's really quite difficult life experience. And she's grateful that she survived these voyages into the strangest sea, and these, involuntary expeditions into the chillest land. And once again, that note of celebration, that note of gratitude, that note of appreciation that we see in these celebratory, nature-inspired poems is captured in the lines that finish this wonderful 12-line poem. Yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So that's the end of part one of our analysis of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Tomorrow there'll be a video which deals with two of her kind of darker poems, and then I'm going to just talk briefly in a third video about the type of questions that have been asked and could be asked on her, and maybe how to go about answering them if she came up in your leaving cert.